The evidence around drug courts is really hard to gauge. Even if you're getting a desired outcome, you have to kind of still question what contributed to that. The same way harm reduction can't alone solve the overdose crisis and over-incarceration and all these other things, drug courts shouldn't be charged with that task or kind of held to that same standard too. The reason I think that they should be held to a higher standard, though, is because of what they ask of their participants.
You're listening to Narcotica, a podcast giving you the straight dope about drugs and the people who use them.
The United States sure loves to cage people. You might be heartened to know that in 2019, the U.S. incarceration rate fell to its lowest level since 1995, according to data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics that came out last year. Nonetheless, the U.S. still incarcerates a larger share of its population than any other country for which we have reliable data. According to Pew Research, at the end of 2019, there were just under 2.1 million people behind bars in the U.S., including 1.4 million under the jurisdiction of federal and state prisons, and roughly 735,000 in the custody of locally run jails. For every 100,000 adult residents in this country, 810 of them are prison or jail inmates. Statistics like these can be shocking, but they can also be cited so often that they can lose their potency. It can seem abstract or just the way things are. But it is completely immoral that the U.S. throws more people into cages than El Salvador, Rwanda, Turkmenistan, China, Brazil, Russia, and Turkey. A big driver for why the U.S. leads on all of this is, of course, the war on people who use drugs. It's not that everyone is in jail or prison because of drugs, yet, as my colleague Chris Maraff often points out, many first or second offenses are for narcotics. And getting given a misdemeanor charge for substance possession or sales can bury someone in so much bullshit that the odds of being incarcerated for other shit is multiplied. Violating parole, 3-strike laws, not being able to afford bail, etc. No matter how you slice it, the drug war plays an outsized role in this experiment in chaos. And there is no evidence that any of this criminal justice crap, this brutal way of policing society, makes any of us safer or healthier. In order to partially address this problem, some jurisdictions have promoted the idea of drug courts, which the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services defines as, quote, alternative to incarceration, drug courts reduce the burden and costs of repeatedly processing low-level, non-violent offenders through the nation's courts, jails, and prisons, while providing offenders an opportunity to receive treatment and education. Sounds great, right? Well, as you'll learn on today's episode, drug courts come with their own set of problems, and in some ways can make situations worse. I'm Troy Farah, and you're listening to Narcotica. We've got a great show for you today. Dave Lucas joined me and Chris. We talked about drug courts, drug testing, and so much more. But first, we want to tell you a little bit about Narcotica. We've been on the air for 4 years trying to cover drugs from a perspective of compassion, science, and evidence. You can find us on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and all that. So do the like and subscribe thing, please. It does actually help us out. You can visit our beautiful website, narcocast.com, to find all kinds of episodes on psychedelics, opioids, stimulants, learn more about drugs like naltrexone or abortion pills, or how big pharma operates with impunity. Drugs are a big, big category, and they let us talk about all kinds of other aspects of social justice and society, from housing to reproductive rights. We have a lot more to cover, and no intention of stopping this show anytime soon, but your help is what keeps us going. If you want to join about 70 other people who make Narcotica possible, just go to patreon.com/narcotica. Patrons can request free stickers, which are personally mailed to you, and get other perks such as 30% off of our store. Speaking of which, you can pick up some new merch at narcocast.myshopify.com, or just go to narcocast.com and click on Shop in the corner. We've got t-shirts and mugs designed by the amazing artist Ryan Gray. We hope you like it. Thanks for supporting us. At Narcotica, we have bills to pay just like everyone else. Everything is getting more expensive, so it's very humbling that folks care enough about this little podcast that just wants to see some goddamn common fucking sense applied to drug policy. Thanks for listening. That's all the boring shit. Now on to the show. Our guest today is Dave Lucas, a clinical advisor, social work educator, and therapist committed to reducing the harms of the criminal, legal, and substance use treatment systems. He serves as a clinical advisor with the Health and Justice Action Lab. Dave, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Also with me today is Narcotica co-host Christopher Moraff, beaming from Kensington. How are you today, Chris?
All right, I'm doing good. How about you, Troy?
I'm great. It's been monsooning in the desert, so it's not too hot. I'm pretty happy about this. So Dave, to start us off, you seem to do a lot of work in drug courts, which thankfully I've never had to navigate. But for everybody that I've ever talked to about this, it's Kafkaesque, to say the least. It is deeply bureaucratic and nightmarish and confusing and expensive. But tell us, can you kind of walk us through this system, what it does and doesn't do, and how people kind of fall in the middle?
Yeah, sure. I'll try to give a brief summary of kind of what the model entails. So drug courts, kind of at the core of the model, is the idea that, putting people with substance use issues who are getting swept up into the justice system, putting them in jail does not do any good. It doesn't help them with their substance use issues, with their social stability issues. And in most cases, the evidence shows that makes things worse for this population and more likely to actually end up back in jail. So the drug court model was kind of started as a response to over-incarceration of drug users as a result of, 70s, 80s, 90s drug policy and policing efforts. And so the whole idea is that this provides an alternative to incarceration, a treatment-based one. I think a lot of the critique comes from the fact that, the treatment has retained some of the carceral elements of the justice system or the criminal legal system. And so this is not just kind of treatment that exists in a vacuum as if you were, using substances, wanted to make a change and you signed up for some treatment on your own. When you do it this way, it comes with a lot of mandates, observed drug testing, court appearances, paying fines and fees, having to, do other types of work in the community to satisfy requirements in order to avoid your prison sentence. And so I think, a lot of the critique just, again, flows from the fact that, it's hard to know to what degree the treatment field has been contaminated by its partnership with the criminal legal system. I think it's fair to say that there's no way for it to remain completely unaffected. And so, a lot of people, will talk about their stories and feel like that they were treated poorly, maybe re-traumatized, infantilized, had excess liberties taken away from them. And so you get those stories. On the flip side, you also get a lot of these like, I was blind and now I can see, these redemption stories. You get a lot of people saying, I went through drug court and it saved my life. And so, I think we can say honestly that drug court for some people has helped them turn around things in their life. But that doesn't necessarily negate the fact that we know that there are a lot of practices that have the potential to harm people and really do need to be looked at critically and reformed in a dramatic way, as long as we're still, unfortunately relying on the justice system or the criminal legal system to deal with substance use, mental health, and, housing, poverty, all the other things, related issues. So,
yeah, it sort of seems like it's presented as a carrot and a stick situation, but it's really just a stick and a smaller stick situation. Like it's put forward as being like a more compassionate and like, at least we're not throwing you in prison for 10 years for having a gram of marijuana or something like that. But in a lot of ways, it's just as bad as like the regular court system. Can you talk to us about like some examples of that?
Yeah, it's a very clever sleight of hand that the field has done because, they're basically saying, well, you should never have been, sentenced to jail in the first place for these issues. But then they also use the fact that you're in this program to kind of, once you sign up, you have to do whatever we say. So, they're kind of getting it both ways. They can say, well, if you don't want to do, this is a voluntary program. If you don't want to do the things that we're asking of you, you can go back into the regular justice system, even though we don't think that that's really the most ethical way to handle your situation. And then they come into drug court, and then the drug court can kind of essentially do whatever they want in terms of, moving people through the program or moving people back or kicking them out or graduating them, whatever it may be. And again, what's tricky about this is, you mentioned carrot and stick, or carrot or stick and smaller stick. There's best practice standards. There's a lot of drug court research out there, but there's no real oversight. You can't go to a local court and tell them to do something. The only thing that really, what we've seen recently that's been effective in that area is the enforcement of the Americans with Disabilities Act to ensure that, court systems are not prohibiting and making accessible, addiction medicine for people, which, was supposed to be the norm, was a recommended practice for years and years in the field, but just, because you can't control what every individual court does, was not happening. And so now you've got kind of an enforcement mechanism for that, but there's no real oversight. You can't, if a judge is doing something that's tantamount to malpractice, you can't get rid of that judge. You can't get rid of a prosecutor. You can't really do anything. So that leads to some really, you get some courts that are following a certain set of, evidence-based practices, and then you get some courts that are, just kind of doing whatever they want. And that's not to say anything of the types of resource deserts that some of these programs exist in, where even if they wanted to provide medication, they can't. So they're just sending people to 12-step meetings at night, right?
The MAT thing was a big problem here in Pennsylvania. I'm not sure if the case even originated from here or not, but read on Bucks County, Chester County, there were quite a few places that were, you had to be off whatever substance, but by the time to graduate, if you were taking Suboxone or whatever. And I just found that to be so counterintuitive.
That's a really good point, and that's just kind of one way that medication is being kind of not properly administered or offered to people. That's just that's incentivizing them to taper off in a potentially really harmful, potentially life-threatening way. But a court like that might tell, if they're being interviewed, or researched, they might say, "Oh yeah, we let participants use these medications," but that doesn't, there might be these other ways that they're creating barriers or incentivizing them to get off of those medications. So we really don't have a great handle on how the field at large is making these medications accessible, and if there's other types of barriers that are kind of more subtle that prevent people from using those medications that, are kind of hard to uncover unless you are looking really closely. But I've done national work on with drug courts, and I've kind of been all around the country. And, if a judge doesn't like these medications, or a prosecutor doesn't, or even a treatment provider doesn't, believe in these medications, that can be enough. They might be allowed. But if a client is seeing that participants who are not using medications are having an easier time, they're being praised by the judge, they're moving through the program more quickly, well, then I wouldn't use those medications either. I would try to do what that other person's doing to make my own life easier. So, even if you legislate things, there are so many ways that these programs can really kind of make your treatment decisions, kind of constrained. And it's not always easy to see that. It's not in the policy and procedure manual. It's not in their rule book. They won't even talk about it. It's just kind of built into the, the DNA of the program. So it's really hard to rein in the entire field and get them on board with certain practices. And that's just in the realm of, addiction medicine. There's so many other practices that are all over the board. Use of jail sanctions, drug testing, admission criteria, graduation criteria, those types of things. So they really, there's a saying in the field, it's not mine, but by one of the leading researchers in the field: if you've seen one drug court, you've seen one drug court. And it really is true. It's, there's no two programs that are alike.
So you talked about how there's no real oversight for drug courts, but how evidence-based are some of these practices? Like, is there a lot of research suggesting that any of this stuff is actually that effective, that it actually helps people instead of, we can all agree, it's very obvious that throwing somebody in jail for substance use even for selling substances, is not. It doesn't accomplish anything except for making people that run prisons more wealthy. So, like, what kind of evidence is there for that drug courts are a better alternative or even more effective in some sense?
Yeah, I think there's smarter people than me to speak to the research, but I would say that there does seem to be, in kind of outside of the drug court world, many scholars would say that the drug court research is as extensive as it is kind of, you know, it's hard to gauge the quality of it. It's a bit dubious, and I say that because even as somebody who worked in one of these programs, it's hard to. How are you measuring success? What if the practices you're using to get success, i.e., graduation, people kind of leaving the program and never returning to the justice system? Well, what if your practices that contribute to that positive outcome are maybe unethical or maybe potentially harmful? Does that justify them? It's, I kind of always use this analogy. Like if somebody slapped me in the face every time I ate a bag of chips at night, I probably would stop eating chips at night before bed. But what if that person's not around? I'll go back to doing that, go back to that habit probably, right? And that's obviously an overly simplistic view, but there's, people are resilient. People go into a program like this and maybe they hate it. Maybe they hate being told what to do. They hate the way they're treated. But they're like, look, I'm going to just make the most of this. And, I got to get out of this program. Maybe I get some housing and I can, I don't want to go to jail. So I'll just put up with whatever I have to get out of it. And so you get a lot of people saying, trying to put a positive spin on that experience. So, I would be, I'm not going to be the person to say like, well, that's false consciousness. You're deluded here. You should really actually be critical. That's their experience at this point. They've graduated and maybe they've come out on, better for it. And then there's other cases where, a drug court team has probably 10 to 20 people on it. You may have a peer support worker and a treatment provider who are really down with harm reduction. And under cover of darkness, they're doing everything they can to support a client, get them through the program, be really patient-centered, trauma-informed with them. They know they're working in a broader kind of model that's like, hard to work within, but they're doing their very best to be kind of like a buffer between that court and that participant. That happens, and it's what's tough about that is like, how do you find those people? How do you research that? How do you find out here and there if it's that person that's contributing to good outcomes? So, that's a very roundabout way of talking about it's the evidence around drug courts is really hard to gauge. Even if you're getting a desired outcome, you have to kind of still question what contributed to that desired outcome, and can we justify? Is it enough to justify that practice? You know, are there and if not, what are the alternatives? Is it worth exploring kind of alternative ways to get there?
I'd like to make note that drug courts are at least responsible, if not primarily responsible, for the proliferation of things like synthetic cannabinoids and ways to get around. So our synthetic, influx of synthetic drugs, at least in some way, shape, or form, is was tasked with, like the street hustlers were the ones smoking K2 at first, to pass their test. So, and that then that transitioned into the mainstream culture. And I don't know how much you would how much stock you would put into that, or how much you've seen that, but there are certainly people that are passing UDS that are taking, arcane analogs of things. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, in the early days, fentanyl was not detected in a lot of the drug testing too. So folks were using opioids and they were getting negative tests, and it was because they were using fentanyl. And obviously now with synthetic cannabis, and then we've got, other types of synthetics that are evolving so quickly that they're not necessarily getting tested. Kratom was another workaround for people. I mean, in my opinion, if you've got people using these types of medications while they're in your program, you're failing on a lot of fronts. You're failing to create a safe space where people can move through recovery at a pace that works for them. You're failing on as therapists or counselors to have good conversations where somebody feels comfortable talking to you about whatever drug that they were using and what benefits they get from it and why they think that they can continue on with this and it's a safe route for them and it helps them get through whatever pain or whatever it is that they're dealing with. If you've got a court that is dealing with a lot of drug tests tampering or synthetic use to get around drug testing, to me, that shows that the problem is not the participants. It's that you have failed to create a space where people can be honest about what's going on for them in their life and what could be helpful. And you know, I think sometimes drug courts tell on themselves a little bit by their obsession with trying to catch people with these kind of new types of drugs. Because if I was a therapist, I would want somebody to talk to me honestly. And I was a therapist, so I'm saying this kind of as somebody with the experience. I don't want to, set them up to put them in a lie detector test every time they're in my office and say, okay, let's talk about how your week went. And I'm going to, you'll get a buzz every time, you tell me something that's not true. My job is to create a strong enough kind of trusting relationship with somebody where they feel they can tell me what they need to, and we can work with that. So, the fact that what Christopher said is true, and I think goes to show that drug courts have gotten so kind of obsessed with making sure that we're catching dishonesty, that we've forgotten that all the other ways that we kind of organically work with honesty and trust in all other kind of clinical settings. They've lost it. Because this is what we were saying during COVID. Like, don't forget, how to work with people. You should, from your training, you should know how to get honest responses or authentic responses from your people if you're building trust with them. The drug test should be confirming what you already know. If you don't know that already, then you need to do your work differently. But, there's other harms that are produced by, forced abstinence is an overdose risk. If you were to seek treatment on your own, you would be working through your reduction of use or change in use at a pace that works for you, at a safe pace. But when you're told, look, you're going to go to either lose your housing, lose your kids, get kicked out of the program if you use, well, if you go from a daily kind of illicit fentanyl and meth habit to suddenly, oh shit, I got to stop everything now or else I'm going to lose all this stuff. Well, we all know what's going to happen that first time that person uses and has kind of a recurrence of use, even if they're trying not to. They're at immense risk. So that's harm production, right? That's a harm that doesn't need to be there. So a lot of the work that I've been trying to focus on in the U.S. is finding the good practices, propping those up, finding the ways that drug courts are producing and inventing new harms that don't need to be there, and trying to get kind of both of them in the same room and say, like, as long as this model exists, we want to really be focusing on these practices that are best practices outside of the drug court world, that are proven elsewhere, in adjacent fields. And then really think critically about what harms we may be producing that we don't need to. If everybody in the field is well intended as they say they are, they should be excited to look at the things that are maybe causing harm and say, like, let's fix that. And sometimes I hear that and sometimes I don't. It's like a lot of these kind of big complex fields.
Yeah, that is a great point about the synthetic drugs, because there are a lot of unknowns about some of these chemicals. They're sometimes euphemistically called research chemicals. They're basically like these molecules that were cooked up experimentally a long time ago and maybe just like in a paper somewhere obscure, and then somebody finds them and decides, oh, I'm going to start selling this because it gives a psychoactive feeling. But there's not a lot of research, or any research, other than maybe some animals if you're lucky. And because people are trying to skirt a lot of times people get in trouble for these drugs and the judge is like, what are you taking this for? But it's not even illegal. And like, you can get in trouble for just because it's just a weird chemical that comes in a package that says not for human consumption. And that's just like, I really like what you said about that being harm production instead of harm reduction.
Yeah, I think one of the problems, going back to the carrot and stick model, is that when drug courts are at their best, they're trying to learn about the person's relationship to drugs and whether or not that relationship to drug use actually is related to why they're involved in the criminal legal system. Is it actually the reason why they've been ensnared in the system or not? And and I would say, as a participant, you can tell the difference. You can tell when somebody really cares about, what do these substances do for you? What are the benefits that you get from them, even though there's risks? What are the things that they do for you? If you're not having that conversation, then you don't get to learn about these other new substances and why they're interested in using them. Is it just curiosity? Is it some other kind of benefit? But as soon as you create kind of a paradigm where if you use, you're in trouble. If you use, you're non-compliant. You shut down the conversation. There's a whole host, this DNA in every use, every time a person in a context, in a mandated treatment context uses. And we don't get to learn about that if we go in either kind of black and white direction. If we say, oh, it's no big deal, whatever, it's just a use, here's your penalty, go do some community service and come back. Or we catastrophize it, and to use a counselor language, and we make it seem like it's the end of the world, and you're one more use and you're kicked out of the program, you're going to go do your 2 years. When we kind of operate in those kind of extremes, we don't learn anything about the relationship that person has to the drugs, and then we end up kind of again in this like panic, and hysteria. We're kind of stuck in this cycle that we've had for years of drug policy in this country about just like, oh, a new unknown drug, and it's obviously going to take over, the drug using world and bring all these harms, and we'll never know about it. We'll just speculate, and we'll let all, police officers and other people who don't know anything about this tell us what this means. And in some ways we have like this audience that could really help us understand these substances, and we could learn so much about them. But because we've set up this punitive model, everybody's scared to actually talk about these things. And again, it's not that it should be happening through the criminal legal system, but this is still such a reality that we may as well figure out a way to make it more helpful, less harmful. And I just want to say one thing that, and this is not entirely relevant to your question, but there's a lot of thinking that decriminalization would spell the end of drug courts. But Canada had basically a de facto decriminalization, or a reduction in drug arrests, and we've seen it in Oregon and Washington State. And it's going to reduce numbers, but most people in drug courts, at least in terms of who's technically supposed to be in a drug court, is not there for drug possession. They're there for theft, for maybe stealing a car, breaking into a storage unit, and things like this that actually carry a prison term. So, something that I think is always important to think about is we don't want to just replace drug courts with drug court light, but we still do need to figure out a way for people whose substance use is connected to why they're in the justice system, why they're over-policed, why they're overly visible, why they're targeted. We still need to figure out a way, another alternative to incarceration, that doesn't bring with it all of the carceral elements that the current model does. I don't exactly know what that is, and I don't know what jurisdiction's ready to do that yet, but I think it's needed. We haven't addressed homelessness. We haven't addressed the illicit drug supply. We haven't addressed wage inequity, and all these types of things that bring people into the system. So we're going to need something kind of in the interim. That's a bit of an aside, but
yeah, no, I a good friend of mine, you may know him, Jeff Deany, was a drug court. He was in the drug courts for a while, and he said the number one question people would ask him, when he asked, "How can I help you?" Well, can you get me a job? Can you get me a job? And it was it. And it seems like drug courts also perpetuate what is, I believe, now scientifically accepted fact that there is no addictive personality, that not every drug is going to have the same impact on each person, and yet the way it's systemically set up is to penalize for even the slightest use of any drug.
In the spirit of trying to be consistent and follow some kind of like evidence-based path, it's hard to kind of be individualized with people, as you're saying. So that everybody's kind of treated as if they've got a severe substance use disorder, regardless of kind of the nature of that use. And often a drug court is only partnered with a few treatment providers. So that means you only get a couple treatment options available to you. But, what you referenced from Jeff Deany, who I really appreciate, and he's been one of my favorite people to talk to about drug courts. And one of the first people I spoke with when I moved here. But he's right. I mean, people want a job and they want a place to live. And it's amazing what that will do for somebody's visibility to the criminal legal system. It's like those are the biggest changes. My program in Toronto, we were dealing with, our population over the years got progressively more acute in terms of social needs. So we essentially shifted to become a harm reduction, housing first oriented model. And our goal was basically, we can't ask anybody in our program to do anything until we've provided housing for them. And that was, in most cases, harm reduction housing, because a lot of our clients were not ready or interested, or, it, stopping use just wasn't even a safe option at that point. So our goal was just get them housing. And for those who like to live rough, because there are a few people out there like that, sometimes we'd get them a place and they would continue to live rough for a little while until they were ready to use that unit and would sit empty, but that was their process, and eventually they would move in. But housing and a job, that's what most people really wanted. As they often say, you can't take something away without replacing it. And if you're going to take away, or you're going to tell somebody you can't, this current life you're living is just going to land you back in the justice system, well, what are you offering? And I think drug courts, what they could do a better job of, and the good ones do this, but what the field in general could do a better job of is say, well, what are we offering, participants that they can't get otherwise? Like, what are if we have these obligations and requirements on them, our obligation should be, we should be able to get somebody addiction medicine if they want it same day. If somebody needs at least provisional shelter, that should be offered same day. If we can't do that, we should never be asking anybody to do anything else. But it doesn't really work that way because, of course, we're still working with this model as if it's an extension of the war on drugs, and it's criminality that brings somebody in. So drug court is a favor as opposed to, and a privilege, rather than drug courts have an obligation to provide, X, Y, and Z. It's more drug courts have an obligation to provide X, Y, and Z because we get good results from it. But for me, that's an ethical and moral obligation. If a court's going to say you need to do these things, the court should at least be on the hook for, a bare minimum of housing, employment, and primary health care, among some, other key services.
Yeah. I think that really touches on a point that we really like to make on this podcast, which is that a lot of drug use is rational. Some people have this perception that the drug users are just these idiots that take whatever and they're just trying to get high and evaporate their feelings or whatever. And I think that probably exists, but it's not really, that's not a typical person. Like, people have a good reason for using a drug. A lot of people that use meth are treating undiagnosed or untreated ADHD, and Adderall is really not that different from meth. A lot of people that take opioids are treating untreated pain or even depression. Opioids can be antidepressants. There are millions of examples. And if drug courts aren't, in general, if society isn't offering like access to safe, regulated drugs, then yeah, people are going to take whatever they can get, even if it's not tested, even if it's adulterated or whatever. So I think that's just like a really great point. And when you were talking about like the limited treatments that are offered, like maybe a drug court has like, hey, you can go to these 3 providers. 2 of them are abstinence-based. The other one is naltrexone. Like, that's not really an option. And if the option between that and failing in a drug court is going to prison for a longer sentence, I mean, there's just so many aspects of society that are fucked up, and the drug court is not even supposed to address. It's no wonder so many people like struggle with this system. One more point I want to make is just that it becomes so frustrating when people on Twitter will post pictures of people in the Tenderloin or in Vancouver on the east side and be like, look at what drug use is doing to these people, and how can you dare say that decriminalization would make things better or that we should have a safe supply or whatever. And it's like blaming all these other systemic failures on the drug use, when at the end of the day, using drugs in those situations is probably one of the smartest things you could do. I know that's kind of crazy to say, but if I was in that situation, I would want something that was going to help me, and drugs can help in some sense. They can also fuck you up, but they can also help.
I think that one of the things that really helped me as a clinician who entered the field very green and with very minimal expertise, which is another thing. There's a lot of people in this field who do not have a ton of expertise, but they get a lot of authority through the courts. But I always say, if somebody's drug use doesn't make sense, make it make sense.
Yeah.
Like, work with them and make it. There's always a reason. People aren't just these kind of robots or zombies moving towards risk for no reason. Everybody does something because of some kind of benefit, and that is your starting point. That is the thing that will unlock what that person really needs, kind of the most, first and foremost, in their life. And I think if you don't get that, then you're just another voice. It's still kind of like that Reagan era voice of that just doesn't get it and will never connect with that person. And you're it's almost impossible to support somebody, because then it ends up kind of like charity. I pity you. I feel so bad for you. I'm going to be really nice to you because I care about you and I'm worried about you. But there's never a real connection in that. Like, I get it. I get why, based on your life, your circumstances, and all the bullshit, this messed up world, why this makes sense. Because I don't care if somebody uses a risky drug because they're bored, or because it's pain, or because it's trauma, or whatever, or because it's fun for them. It's part, to quote Jeff Deeney, I think he's talked about it, that it's, maybe not discussed enough how much drug use is just a way to deal with ennui, the boring existence of our, this late stage capitalist, um, you know, mess of a world. And
Yeah.
you know, I think that's okay. Just if somebody's is using drugs for that reason, whatever. But what else? Since you're in this program and I'm here to help you out, is there anything else in your life that we can work on to just kind of make things a little easier for you? Because you and I both know being in jail is pointless. It's going to cause harm. So let's just try to avoid that. One thing that comes up in the drug court world a lot is people say, well, that guy's just trying to avoid jail. He doesn't really want to change. And I'm like, wanting to avoid jail is actually a good thing.
Yeah.
We don't want people to think that they belong in jail because they use drugs. It's so crazy to me that's just a normal, that's an issue that people see with people coming into these programs, is that, that's their primary motive. Well, good. That means that they still have hope for their life. They want some liberty. They still want to enjoy their life and not be, you know, um, exposed to all the obvious harms that come with jail. And to me, though, I was always like, okay, so let's work with this. Nobody is perfectly satisfied with their life. Let's find the area that we can work with. But again, this is kind of, it's not as satisfying. I think the three of us are all come from the same perspective with this, but this is just not the justice system. A judge and a prosecutor, who are appointed or elected, they want to be able to point to results. They want to say, we graduated this many people in this amount of time. This is how we're spending our money. We saved this amount of money. They want to be able to kind of show with data, their outcomes. So the things I'm talking about maybe slows down the process a little bit. It's a little harder to measure, and I think that's why it's kind of hard to integrate maybe, across the board.
So just to throw a little wrench into what we were just talking about, this would have been in the 90s, maybe before drug courts were even a thing. But that there were treatment centers for. I'm thinking of one in particular that I went to, that was ostensibly for people with problems with addiction. But when I was there were two of us that had addiction problems, and all the rest were drug dealers trying to get out of jail earlier. And then they were, they looked fine, looked the part. They were used to go foot races around. I mean, they weren't, and they actually had to separate one of the drug users, because he just wasn't integrating well with. It was messing with his recovery. And all these guys talked about how they're going to get back out on the street and start turning money and getting. I mean, it was just their way. If they said they had a drug problem, they knew that they could get early release.
Yeah, and again, that kind of just reveals another, broken piece of the system, where we've created something that could be a potential solution, and now we're kind of we're ensnaring these other people who, could, first off, if you're in a drug court and you don't actually have kind of a really problematic, relationship with drugs, you're probably going to end up worse off. The statistics show that people who are brought into drug courts who don't really belong there, people with, like, just kind of casual drug use, or have never really been in the justice system before, or are primarily in the world of drugs for selling or trading reasons. Their outcomes tend to be pretty bad. I used to have a couple guys on my caseload who I knew were sellers first, users second. And you know what? Generally speaking, their life wasn't that great. Their life usually was, their clothes were a little bit better, and they could kind of keep it together. They could make appointments a little bit better, but generally, they had their shit that they had to work on. And if my challenge was always like how to get them to be authentic about what they still needed to work on. If I had to work with them anyways, and I wasn't going to sit there and accuse them of being a drug dealer and get them out of the program. I was going to try to make it worthwhile, and as well, and try to protect the other clients I was working with so that they weren't getting kind of taken advantage of.
Of course, yeah, and of course there's crossover. There's a lot of crossover, at least certainly here in Philly, between the drug sellers and drug users. I mean, I think most, if not all, of the street, like lowest level drug dealers are a lot of them have drug habits as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, by the end of it, I just felt like I ran men's groups. They were just groups for men who were living kind of on the margins, whether they were selling or using or both. They were people who generally had trauma histories, came from low income backgrounds, or, they just couple wrong turns, and that's the world they ended up in. And they either wanted to stay there and just, live a little bit more stably, or they wanted out and they wanted to reconnect with their family, and we'd work on that. But, the drugs were kind of a part of the picture, but so often it's just one feature. I mean, the reason why a lot of people, we know this, that end up in drug using communities for these long stretches is because it's community. That's the other thing too. And one other piece with drug courts is they really are big on getting out of the drug using world, stop associating with people who are, from that world. And that's just like, talk about, I mean, imagine the three of us suddenly just lost our jobs tomorrow. And not only do we lose our jobs, we're not allowed to associate with anybody from our field anymore. And we're just told, yeah, I got to do a brand new, like, that is completely life and identity altering.
Yeah.
And without replacing it, just because you're in a group room with a couple of other dudes from drug court doesn't mean you have a new community. You've got that maybe 3 or 4 times a week, but that's not, you can't, those aren't friendships. That's not trust. That's not mutual aid and support. And it's not somebody who's, maybe bearing witness to your experience for the last 10 years living on the street. So that's another piece that I think drug courts could do better with, or, the practitioners in that field, is understanding that, people, if you're asking them to stop using, that means that they lose their community, their primary activity, often their primary coping mechanism, their nickname, what they're good at. Are they the person who's good at, like, divvying up are they the person who can, like, when everybody sits down after you've bought your drugs and gets it all ready for everybody? Like, some people, I remember, used to be so proud of that was their thing, right? Or are you the guy in the group who's the best at boosting to make in a pinch when everybody needs a fix? Everything comes with an identity, and if you're not working with somebody to replace, but what happens in the drug court, context, is you're really encouraged to just get rid of all of it. It's, and what we know from the world of psychotherapy is that if you learn about yourself as these kind of like Jekyll and Hyde characters, and you're trying to just suppress one version of yourself, it'll never go away. You have to integrate these people. Yeah, like, recovery involves integrating all parts of you and not necessarily demonizing the drug user self or yourself just for the fact that you were using drugs. Drug courts don't really embrace that concept. They actually do the opposite. They kind of want you to walk away from that world and leave it all completely behind. And certainly there's some practicality to that, because maybe that's the only way some people will ever get out of the justice system.
They've never left that 4 square block area, and in a residentially segregated city like Philadelphia, their families there. They're and you're telling them they can't. Where are they going to go?
Yeah. I sometimes will talk to somebody in who works in the court system and say, "Do you know what chosen family is? Do you know when we talk about drug using communities, when somebody says that's my aunt or that's my cousin or that's my my mom, when they say that, do you know that often doesn't mean they're actually related, but this is their family. This is the people that help them survive, and if they're at risk, if they're doing sex work, this is the person who kind of helps them navigate that, or and we're pulling people out of this without giving them any other resources, like almost overnight. And again, that to me that's a form of harm production. It's not respecting that person has roots and important connections, And it's forcing somebody to demonize a part of their world that, whatever risks exist, those people somehow help mitigate them and help them get by and give them that additional sense of meaning. So these are, this conversation, where the direction's headed is it's hard to kind of impose this lens into criminal justice conversation. But I think the most important thing that can maybe lead there is to look at the black and white practices, things like drug testing, the use of sanctions, the use of like the stick when just because somebody uses or they miss a group, and try to get away from kind of these black and white responses to things. And I think that's kind of the entry point to really transforming this model until it's no longer serves a function. We want to see drug court participation diminish because we want upstream solutions so that people are getting these things without having to access them through the justice system. The guilty plea at the entry point of a drug court should not be, your ticket to housing, your ticket to a doctor, your ticket to addiction medicine, if that's what you want. But when I worked in Toronto, I used to think like, man, this drug court seems like the easiest way for somebody who's using drugs and homeless. The easiest way for them to get housing is to get into this program, and that seemed really tragic. And
who's making money off this? Like, let's talk about what this is an incentivized program, obviously. I mean, and there's people that are stakeholders and entrenched in keeping it the way it is, right? The status quo.
Yeah.
What is the benefit? Who's fighting against reform?
Well, I'll just say, before commenting on who's fighting against reform, I'll just say there's a lot of industries that are connected that survive off of problem-solving justice, whether that's drug courts or other types of kind of alternative to incarceration models. And that's information management systems. So tracking all of a person's movements throughout the justice system and treatment and healthcare, and collating all of that information and so that, all that data can be tracked and evaluated and analyzed and used to get more funding. There's, people who create those programs. There's all the compliance monitoring, ankle bracelets, GPS, breathalyzers, sweat patches, hair tests. There's sober housing. There's for-profit treatment. There's all the billing Medicaid billing that's related to drug testing again. I mean, there's a lot of, I think you both probably saw this, but when Oregon decriminalized all drugs, there was some outcry from the treatment field who thought, well, how are we going to get people into our programs if they're not mandated through the justice system? Which, again, what an indictment. How good are your services if you can't get people to come unless they're forced to come? And yes, I understand that it's, a lot of people who are in the throes of really problematic use. They're not walking up to treatment centers often on their own, whatever. Why would they? Most treatment centers we have so many reasons to not trust healthcare and our treatment providers, just as we don't with the justice system. So, yeah, I don't know if that really answers your question, but I think anybody who, in terms of like pushing back against reform, I'm sure those fields probably are not interested in it, but they stay out of the conversation. We have like leading voices in the drug court world who probably just don't think that drug courts would work well without some of the things we've talked about, without the incentive and sanction model, without drug testing, without kind of this, big role of the judge. It's a big part of the model is like the connection that the participant has with the judge. I think there's a lot of things that people are under the impression that if you got rid of these things, drug courts wouldn't even work and it would spell the end of it. So let's just keep going with what we have. You'll never hear anybody just saying outright, we don't want reform. They'll say, this is an evidence-based practice. We have years of research backing this up. So, but what's tough is it's really hard to do a double blind in the drug court world. The main critique of the research in the drug court world is that it's really hard to compare a control group to create a proper control group to measure against drug court participants.
Right. Since you brought up Oregon and Measure 110, I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on this, and maybe I should ask somebody that actually lives in Oregon, but what do you think of how it's going? Because a lot of people are like saying, hey, look, crime rates have risen in Oregon or whatever, which I don't even know if that's true. Uh, and then they say, well, this is because of this decriminalization law. Like, how can you just let, quote, criminals run around and now it's making everything worse? Like, I kind of want to talk about other areas of reform, but, do you feel like Measure 110 has been successful or unsuccessful, or is it too early to tell?
I think it's too early to really know, because the types of things that you need in order to make Measure 110 successful, from what I've read, I think my sense is that Measure 110 happened really quickly in terms of, they didn't have decriminalization, and then they did. And they didn't have necessarily the treatment and the services needed to, and a whole kind of infrastructure to support people in an upstream way. If you're going to kind of remove that pathway to services, you still want people to access those services. But I don't think in Oregon necessarily there was the funding and the availability and the infrastructure to get people connected to the services that keep them out of the justice system. And so maybe we haven't seen the best results yet in terms of just, I don't know the arrest rate numbers. I don't know if that's just kind of fear mongering headlines, or if that actually, if there's any truth to that. But from what I've learned from people I've spoken to there, I think it's been tough to provide adequate, sufficient services to people, even though there's going to be funding for that. It's just, you can't just, they don't open treatment centers the way they open up condo buildings, right? You don't get them at the same pace, and they don't open up public housing the same way they do condos. So I think the problem is Measure 110 is about reducing pointless arrests, not only pointless, but the kind of arrests that cause more harm by bringing people into the justice system for just possession, which should never, people in drug court should never be in drug court just for possession, by the way. The statistics, even the most conservative, drug court researcher will tell you that is the wrong population for drug courts. They should not just be in there for possession. So what at least decriminalization should reduce those types of arrests. But I think Oregon probably needs more time to use, the funding that they're gonna have, to ramp up services that actually make kind of more of a population level difference for people living on.
Right. It's like we were talking about earlier. Like, there's all these other aspects that are, driving poverty and driving crime, that if you remove one aspect of it, which is a step in the right direction, it's not going to solve everything. Like, a lot of people are critical of harm reduction because it didn't cure cancer or something ridiculous, like it's not designed to do. And I often sometimes have this like sort of paranoid conspiracy theory thought that's like, some harm reduction measures that get passed are designed to fail because they're not designed to address every other aspect of society that's failing. And so that the drug warriors can step back and say, hey, look, this is Measure 110 is not working. Therefore, why should we end the drug war? You know what I mean? Like, if you're not going to provide healthcare or housing to people, and you're not going to see a difference in homelessness or crime on the streets, then, I mean, the drug war is sort of even almost irrelevant to that. It's like it's just a tool of oppressing poor people. I mean, that sounds a little almost too leftist for me, but like, it's true. That's why these laws were designed. I mean, that's historical.
Yeah, I would just say, and by the same token, to some degree with drug courts, we want to be fair to that field and say, drug courts can't solve the overdose crisis. They can't, that's not really they can't solve homelessness. I mean, drug courts should not be in charge of making America more sober. It shouldn't be in charge of housing people. It shouldn't be in charge of the overdose crisis. What it should be in charge of is making sure that everything that they ask of somebody in order to ensure that they can justify to their jurisdiction somebody not going to jail for certain, things that have affected community safety, that they're providing, in addition to, or in, kind of to offset those obligations of the participant, that they're offering adequate, good quality, high quality, evidence-based services, in equal measure. That's really it. But drug courts shouldn't be here, the same way harm reduction can't alone solve the overdose crisis and over incarceration and all these other things. Drug courts shouldn't be charged with that task or kind of held to that same standard too. The reason I think that they should be held to a higher standard, though, is because of what they ask of their participants. Like, look, if you're going to ask this much, you better be offering the same, if not more, so that that person is drowning in good services and good treatment to the point where no matter what happens, their situation, their life ends up better. Like if you can't say you're doing that, if somebody is sitting in jail for 150 days waiting for a treatment bed before they can even start drug court, and the first one that's available doesn't even accept methadone or buprenorphine, you're not doing your job. You know, you are a harm producing program. That is, you know, you should shut your doors until you can fix that. But that's something that, you know, exists all over the country. And I think that to me is maybe the biggest issue is just kind of what goes on that we don't know about. You can create all the standards in the world and say, these are the best practices. Please, drug courts, do this. But if we don't really have any infrastructure to really kind of keep an eye on things, you know, we get the critiques that we deserve.
I think this is a good place to wrap up. But before we do, I wanted to see if Chris had any other questions, and I also wanted to ask about places that you see that are sort of moving in the right direction on this issue, like other examples that are of drug courts, perhaps, you know, doing stuff that is actually helping their I don't know if you call them clients or participants or victims or what, you know, but people who are in these systems that are actually benefiting from them, and how.
Yeah, I wouldn't feel comfortable necessarily pointing to a particular court or jurisdiction, but I've spoken to practitioners before who really are approaching the work the way we've talked about it today, which have kind of like that systems level lens. And I think it exists. I think that they feel like outliers and almost like an outcast in the world. And so we need to figure out maybe how to bring them together so that we can kind of have some more, you know, widespread change. They do exist. I present often and do these webinars and go to conferences. And what I'm always taken aback by is how many people come up after I'm done and say, it's so nice to hear somebody talk about things this way. And, you know, if I was talking about these things with any other type of clinical audience, nobody would come up and talk to me. But in the drug court world, I think it's somewhat rare. So I know that they exist. I know that there's people who'd like to, who have ideas and have very practical, you know, we need to get something that exists between let's abolish drug courts and let's leave them the way they are. Even if you believe that drug courts are ultimately the wrong solution, we do need something to get us to that point. And I do think that there's a lot of people in this country who have ideas about how to make things more patient-centered, safer, more overdose prevention friendly, and to try to kind of just really pull apart all the remaining pieces of the war on drugs that still color the core practices of the field. And I still think that there's a way for the system to kind of really be helpful and be, you know, more service oriented than kind of carceral as it has been. It's not a very specific answer, but I think I think there is some hope there.
Well, I like what you said about Toronto, because I think that if you're in drug court for committing a crime, you should not be policed for things that are not criminal. And drinking and if marijuana is legal in your county, you know, it's just, you know, it just doesn't make any sense, you know. So I mean, I don't know how pervasive that is. I think in the States it's probably pretty pervasive that you're tested for certainly for marijuana. I think there's been movement, like you said, on the Americans with Disabilities Act, because that always seemed like a terrible idea for me. It's terrible that medical professionals can't even take the drugs that they're prescribing other people to take, you know, for the same problem. People lose their license for that, and you know, so we have these mixed messages that we're sending, and certainly getting away from sending those mixed messages and being, you know, really clear about why you're here is important.
Yeah, I agree. And, you know, just to wrap up with, you know, an example of change that is possible, the Toronto Drug Court, it wasn't always like this, but the Toronto Drug Court in the last couple of years has graduated, you know, back when I was there and even recently, they've graduated people who not only are they using cannabis, but they're using occasionally using crack. Somebody recently was still using opioids, like, street, not prescribed opioids, but like occasionally used heroin and still graduated because of all of the other things that they had kind of accomplished while they were in the program and all the other signs of stability and work that they had put in. And the court basically said, what are we holding on to this person for? They're doing really good. They've got education on overdose prevention and harm reduction. They've got, they're either in school or working, and they've got social connections, and they've, done their best. And we don't have any indicators saying that this person is a threat to the community. They barely were in the first place. Even that concept is so overblown. And to me, that's a really good sign. If treatment courts, first off, I would love to just rename the whole kind of field as like housing and health justice courts, because if you rename it, you could shift the focus right away to services, and you could focus on, social stability and person, and health first, and then, everything else would come secondary, and you could graduate people for just kind of getting things in order and getting their life to a better place than it was, and the drug use would be secondary. But anyways, that's kind of a pipe dream. But I would just say that it is possible, and in Toronto, the fact that people can leave the program getting a dignified exit, avoiding jail, even if they're continuing to use their primary substance, that's a big step. That is starting to kind of take out the prohibition. It's teasing out some of the prohibition threads that have always colored the model since its inception.
Well, do you feel optimistic about the future of drug courts, things changing, and the direction things are going?
I don't know. I don't know how to separate my thoughts about drug court from the broader U.S. political climate. I think things swing back and forth, and I've, like I said at the beginning, I've put out some writing on this, and the response, I got really good positive response from people in the field, and I got really, really negative response as well from people who thought that, it was too critical and I was asking too much of the field. So it's hard to know. I know that you can do it kind of it almost feels the same way thinking about harm reduction. Is harm reduction, for every step forward with harm reduction, it seems like there's a step back. There's another headline about somebody, being in the same neighborhood as aerosol fentanyl and passing out. For every effort made to educate people on these types of things, on what works, there's another group organizing against a supervised consumption site. So if I didn't feel some hope, I wouldn't do the work. And to me, you always have to work at two levels. You work for transformative system change, and then you also do what you can to help people who are in the system right now. That's kind of what I do. I just think about, maybe drug courts won't exist because we have a better solution one day. Right now, people are in drug court. I want their lives to be better. I want them to be treated with more dignity and more, have more safety as they figure out whatever it is they want to change in their life. So I think you just work at both levels, and you hope to see, the needle move a little bit. But yeah, it's a slog.
Yeah, it is a slog. So thank you for doing the work. Dave, where can people find you online?
I'm on Twitter at David E.W. Lucas. If you ever want to chat about these types of things, you can reach me through the Health and Justice Action Lab. I'm on their website there, and I think my email address should be there too. So I'm always happy to talk about this kind of stuff.
Yeah, great. Thank you for coming on the show. This was really informative, and I think people will really resonate with this.
Yeah, thanks, Dave.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Narcotica, an independent production by Troy Farah, Christopher Moraff, and Zachary Siegel. I'm your co-producer, Aaron Ferguson. If you like the show, you can find out more at narcocast.com and support us by joining our Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/narcotica. Patrons get free stickers, which are personally mailed to them, and can request a shout-out on the show. And now, Patreons can even get 30% off merch in our new store, which is at narcocast.myshopify.com. We have t-shirts and coffee mugs, one that says, "There are drugs in here," which is awesome. More stuff will be added soon. As always, we're so grateful to the folks that make this show possible.